Welcome everybody today. We're here to talk about what happens when we're splitting up a property pool and there's two properties involved. One of them's the residence that the couple have lived in, and another one's an investment property. So, I'm joined here today by Ramona and Montana. Welcome ladies.
Good morning, Ashley.
Thanks, Ash.
So I might start with you, Ramona. We've got two properties. One's an investment property and one's the normal residence. Let's say in this scenario, if I may, that one of the parties, let's call that person Annie, is earning over $250,000 a year, and she's elected to have the investment property. What are some of the things that should be raising a red flag?
Yeah, so what she needs to be aware of is that having an investment property versus a main residence property comes with tax implications on that property. And so she needs to be aware of that at the stage of the settlement, as well as in future, because she's potentially going to have to pay tax on the gain of the property, depending on how long she's owned it for, how much it's increased in value, and when she sells it, what she's done with it in that time.
Okay, if I can just, let's put some hypothetical numbers to this. The house they live in is worth 800. The investment property is worth 800, but they bought it 30 years ago for 200. What happens to Annie if she decides that after living in the investment property, which might be up on the Sunshine Coast, after a year that she needs to spread her wings and move to Sydney, and she wants to sell it? What's going to happen?
Yep, so she needs to look at the property and figure out how long she's lived in it. So if she's lived in it for a year, but had it for 30 years, potentially that gain since when she bought it, $200,000, to the date where it became her main residence, $800,000. That's a $600,000 gain that she's potentially up for tax on. And she can look at the main residence exemption and potentially get the last year of her living in that property tax-free. But that's 1 year out of 30, that's a massive capital gain to have to deal with. So it's a big number, and she's already at $250,000 earnings in a year, so she's paying 47% tax on that gain on $600,000. So you're looking at circa $300,000 of tax. Massive gain, definitely something that you need to think about in the settlement, and just to be aware of that's going to hit. Okay, so Annie, we've got a problem here. So that's when we come to you, Montana. So what advice do you give Annie? And when we go to split these assets up, how do you do the calculations and what's involved in the negotiation?
So as Ramona said, you obviously have to factor that into any settlement, but you need to do that really even before the settlement stage. So if I'm acting for Annie, Annie comes to me and I get these numbers from her, we involve the accountants, get these estimates from the get-go. I need to advise Annie that, well, hey, you might be receiving a property and your ex-spouse might be receiving the other property, but the one he's receiving is your principal place of residence. So he's getting it tax-free in effect, and she's going to be hit with this large tax bill. So it's not really fair, even though the properties might be worth much of a muchness, and on the face of it, it looks like an equal split. It's not. So she needs to be advised of that from the get-go, and that needs to be factored into any negotiations. So really, that liability should be included in the asset pool that we're dividing, even though it's not payable on the transfer. So say, for example, family court orders are made or agreed to that says Annie receives this property, the CGT is not payable on that transfer from husband and wife jointly to Annie, but ultimately whenever she disposes of the property, that's when it's going to hit her. And sometimes people aren't aware of that, sometimes people aren't advised of it at the time, and then many years down the track they realise it and they come back and say, you know, why wasn't I advised of this? So it's really, really important that type of stuff is dealt with at the beginning. The other thing we see is sometimes there are multiple investment properties, and the parties have agreed, for example, to sell it all off and liquidate everything and divide the assets. Again, figuring out what that CGT is at an early stage is really important. Sometimes we stagger the sales of them in different financial years. Sometimes it's usually the accountants to come up with these sorts of strategies, but you know, if we know there's going to be a loss on one, we might sell that one first so that we can carry forward the losses into the next year, or whatever it might be. But people all too often forget about CGT liabilities.
Okay, and so is it a relatively easy thing to negotiate when you know early?
Absolutely, it's just a matrimonial debt, and it's, you know, for example, the properties might be unencumbered, both of them, but we can't just ignore that debt, so it needs to be included almost as if it's a mortgage. I mean, it's a debt associated with the property, so it just goes into the asset pool, and then that asset pool is what's ultimately divided.
Okay. And do you see this happen much, Ramona, that people haven't considered these tax implications?
Yeah, they come out a lot in the litigation and the forensic issues, is when people look back and go, wait a minute, I didn't get advised this, you know, no one told me this, I now have this massive, you know, $300,000 tax bill. Why did no one tell us this? And it's something that's very important to do at the start, because it can hit you hard. That's a big tax bill to get in 1 year. And if you haven't prepared for that, you don't have the cash, it's a physical cash outlay that you need to find. And so that can cause all sorts of problems, and that person's going to try and find an out or someone to blame as well. And so it's very important to get good advisors, make sure you've got a good team around you to know that at the outset before you get into all sorts of strife down the track.
Yeah. Well, look, it seems like it's a simple thing to fix, and it's one of the things, if it's often overlooked, then it'd be a really dreadful mistake to make. So I'd like to thank both of you for highlighting the issue of making sure that if there's an investment property involved in a matrimonial property settlement, to do your sums in terms of capital gains tax, because it'll save you a lot of grief down the track. So thanks, Ramona.
Thank you.
And thank you, Montana.
Thanks, Ashley.